Thank you very much. Your presentation is really give us the another kind of issues, how to deal with these issues through the WTO. I think you mentioned, and also other people mentioned, that Korea's role is very important because Korea is not a big country, but not a small country. Maybe middle country get together and provide some suggestions how to solve the issues at the WTO. But you know, we can have a long discussion on how to save the Doha round and everything. But now it's time for inviting some questions from the floor. If anybody want to give a question, then please raise your hand. And then you briefly introduce yourself, and your question should be very brief. And you can also address to certain specific person. Anybody who want to raise a question from the floor?
Yeah, I'm Jang Taek-hyun from Kiev. My question was directed to Professor Owen and Deputy Director General Xiaojun Lee. That is related with the service. Lee Sang-jin pointed a little bit of it. I think in presentation, you talked quite a lot about the trade and trends and the cause and results. But can you decompose this manufacturing trade to service trade? In my opinion, as one of the slides in Lee Sang-jin showed that as far as service trade is concerned, actually it is rising, and there is a great potential about that increasing in services in trade. And for example, the China's, I think, structure of the economy is changing from the manufacturing to the service. And there are still a lot of room for potential for increasing service trade because it is at the initial stage. So that again is related with the foreign direct investment. So if there is some more opening about the foreign direct investment, for example, even in the case of China and US, they are still talking about the bilateral investment treaty. So my question is, if we try to more opening more efforts in service area, then will there be more potential in service trade promotion and trade in general? Thank you.
Okay, the question was about the role of trade in services. Maybe at the moment, maybe trade in services are increasing rather than decreasing, but overall trade is now stagnating. So I want to hear from the experts on this issue, and even including China-US bilateral investment treaty, which may promote foreign direct investment or trade in services. I will collect one or two more questions and then go back to the panelists. Anybody who want to ask questions here? Yes, please. Please identify yourself briefly. And then.
Sure. Joshua Meltzer from the Brookings Institution. Thank you for all the panelists for their excellent presentations. This is probably a little bit directed to Dago, but if anyone wants to jump in, that'd be great. I just want to, you had a slide up there which I thought was quite convincing, where you showed changes in elasticity over the decades and we're sort of back to a trend, yet you seem to not feel comfortable stopping and saying that this is essentially sort of structurally driven by these patterns. And there's been a discussion about rising protectionism, and clearly an important issue, and we should look at that. But I just want to push you a little bit more on the aggregate demand picture here, because you know, we've had low growth in the EU, we've had, you know, unexpectedly, you know, below trend growth in the US. China's clearly been slowing, and we had the financial crisis, which is the sort of discontinuation between that. And I would just like you to maybe talk a little bit more about why that is not explaining most of what's going on here. And if it's not, do you have a sense of how important the other rising trade protectionism is in the picture? I mean, is it a marginal issue? Is it a bigger part of it? I mean, it'd be good to sort of break that down a little bit more.
Thank you very much. I think this is a question on the role of protectionism and also kind of effect of world global recession after the financial crisis. In other words, trade flows are more affected by declining in world demand rather than protectionism. This is a very important question we are facing. One more question, Professor Dr. Chung from Kiev. And then I close the question, and then I hear from the panelists.
Yes, Chol Chung from Kiev. My question actually directs to Deputy Director General Lee Xiaojun first, because you're going to leave after maybe earlier, and this is related with the Session 3 digital trade. I mean, we all know that the digital trade has been growing so dramatically, and then we are talking about the trade for growth in this session. So, but one of the things that we know is that even if the digital trade is growing dramatically, we do not have much regulations or the international rules and so on. So, what is the take of the WTO on these issues? I mean, it's kind of one of those new trade issues. Anybody else may be answering this, but I'd like to hear from the Deputy Director General Lee first. Thank you.
Okay, now we have 3 questions addressed to some questions to specific person, but it doesn't matter. I mean, we'll rotate speakers, and you say whatever you want to say. Professor Irwin first.
So the question on the decomposition between services trade and manufacturing trade, that's an excellent point, because almost all the good data where the economists have done some studies of this is in trade and manufactured goods, or including more broadly agriculture and other things. And it completely ignores largely services trade. So to the extent there's a difference, and that services trade is being driven by foreign investment, which has continued to percolate along, that's a necessary corrective, I think, to the overall situation. So I don't have any good facts or figures to give you, but I think that's an excellent point. On your point about the elasticity and the composition of growth and things of that sort, so I guess a couple of points. So yes, the elasticity has come down, normalization, if you will. I don't quite trust that, because it's obviously, you estimate it, you're using a span of years. When you look at the most recent years individually, trade is growing less than, and obviously Simon has shown that maybe trade is even declining, less than output growth. So that means elasticity is, 1 or less than 1, which is would be new and disturbing. It has come down too because of compositional effects. So I think the IMF made this point in saying that because investment has been very sluggish, usually it's investment-led growth that really promotes trade growth. And so if we're just consumption command is sort of holding up the economies, and we're not getting the investment back, that's holding back the trade growth. So there definitely is the composition of growth holding things back. And then I'm not going to take a stand on protectionism. It is a factor. I'm going to wave my hands about how much. I think it's very hard to identify how much. Simon, once he gets more years of data, we'll get some numbers on this. But, and obviously the counts don't look good in just in terms of the number of measures. But translating that into what is the impact? What % of the slowdown is due to this? It's very hard to say. And so I'm not willing to take a stand on that yet.
Thank you. I will invite Commissioner Lee. You want to say something?
Regarding the service, trade in service, I think that we do need some sort of the best case scenario and regulatory barriers being reduced. For example, most favored nations and national treatment, and then the restriction on the service supply, something like that. So this is being discussed within the frame of the TISA as well as APEC service roadmap. So if we create some sort of the framework for the service sector, then I think that there is some hope for facilitating international trade and against the protectionism stance. And then in particular, I think there are, because even in the case of the manufacturing goods and adding the IT and the software applications that this, conventional product has been turned into the service-oriented sectors. So this kind of industry is going to be made. So I think that it's important to shift our gear to the service sector facilitations. Regarding the, financial crisis, correlation between the international trade and financial crisis, as I mentioned, that I think that we need to investigate more deeply into the whether there is any kind of a correlation between the international trade and then aggregate demand because of the financial crisis and long-term recessions. So that's a hot topic at the level of the Federal Reserve Board. So without further ado, I cannot make a conclusion, but anyhow, it's a dispute. Regarding the e-commerce, I think that I'm pretty much sure about this e-commerce or transborder online transaction will be on the surge. So we need to be very careful. Any kind of protectionism measures can get into this kind of rising industry. So once we create some sort of the regional association or regional free trade agreement, then this e-commerce may be facilitated to a great extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Director General.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to respond to a few points. First, services. I am happy to hear that you mentioned the services, because in WTO, services is the most promising area to move. And we heard a lot of WTO members are raising new requests and new proposals. They focus recently on domestic regulation and others. And some members even raised services facilitation. So we hope we can see real progress on services in the near future. And another point is foreign investment. It's closely related to the services, because the mode 3 of services account for 60% of world. 60% of the world services are foreign investment. So we hope our members will be more open to discuss investment issue in WTO. And as for protectionism, I do think it's a serious threat. Although, we have a number that the G20 members imposed trade restrictions, which accounted for 5% of the world trade and 60.5% of G20 imports. But I think they are all important players. They should lead by example to refuse the new restrictions and roll back existing restrictions. And finally, e-commerce or digital trade. I would argue that the WTO existing rules, most of them apply to digital trade, including trading goods, including services, trips, and development. But meanwhile, we want to know what extra we need to foster the promising e-commerce in the future. So we encourage all members to discuss this issue, and we see a very serious engagement recently.
Yes, Professor Ebenhead.
I'd like to address directly Joshua's question about the impact of protectionism. So first, I'd like to make 3 points, actually. First, there is this finding that, that the investment slowdown has led to the trade slowdown. Well, that just, for me, begs the question, what's driven the investment slowdown? If you dig into the literature on that, we have a very robust finding that economic policy uncertainty is one of the big drivers of the investment slowdown. That's work coming out of Stanford and Northwestern, which has been published in the best journals in economics. And you have to ask how much of that economic policy uncertainty is domestic and how much is foreign. What this line of argument makes you realize is that so much of the literature on the global trade slowdown is pretty sloppy because it doesn't get to the root causes. And all too often, the policy side of the story is swept under the carpet because people can't download data on it nicely and throw it into a regression, so it gets ignored. That's the real problem here. Not enough attention to the root causes of the investment slowdown. The second point I would make is that when you're thinking about the impact of aggregate demand on trade, you have to watch out for all the expenditure switching policies. And there are lots of expenditure switching policies out there. We've got governments which have been using buy local policies or buy national policies, switching potential spending away from imports. We've had a whole raft of those. We have localization requirements forcing investors to buy local parts and components. These all switch potential purchases from imports as well. No one's got to the bottom of that. No one's asked the question, if the Chinese supply chains are changing and they're sourcing so much more locally, how much of that is due to Chinese government policy? Again, you begin to see there's a lot more handles here which people haven't got round to investigating. Let me just say the third point here is we did do a very detailed study of the impact of protectionism on the exports of the least developed countries, and we controlled for aggregate demand levels in that study. And we still found the impact of protectionism. More precisely, we found that the more an LDC was exposed to trade distortions in third markets when it exported, the more its exports were held back. To give you a sense of the scale, here are some statistics. Before the global economic crisis, since the year 2000, LDC exports grew in nominal terms 20% a year. After the crisis, from 2008 to 2013, from 2009 to 2013, LDC exports grew by 5.7%. Okay? We estimate that if they had not faced any additional crisis-era discrimination, that export growth would have been 11.2%. Over those 5 or 6 years, that accumulates to a 32% loss in exports, about $250 billion. This is for the poorest countries in the world. So I think there is a price tag we can put on protectionism. Those results are results which have now been published. I would go to the wall defending them, given how many robustness checks we did. So I think the evidence is there when people really want to look seriously. The problem is people haven't been looking seriously.
Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes before we close the session. Any questions from the floor? Yes, over there and also over there. There's two questions I will receive.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Hussein Ghazwi. I'm from the Embassy of Morocco. I want to make a comment on Dr. Evnit's idea about, he brought a very good citation, by the way, from the chairman of GE when he talked about localizing industry in this developing or emerging markets, which I see as a very good approach, because the terms of trade have not been just from the perspective of these poor or underdeveloped developing countries and also these emerging markets. So I think that localizing industries in these countries at least give them a chance, first to upgrade their economies, create jobs, ensure a transfer of technology, flow of capital, and all these are positive signs of a reshuffling or reorientation of this international trade that has been so much unfavorable to poor and developing countries. So in your sense, is this the best approach to at least move away from the top-down approach that favor export-oriented economies at the expense of those markets that have been always seen as consumer markets and profitable markets for these big multinationals? Or should we think, I think, to create more like mechanisms within the Trade Organization to have a rather favorable conditions for these who have been always trapped in poverty trap or the middle income trap. And we have a lot of examples in the South Asian countries who have started these manufacturing processes or industries for a long time, but they have never been able to move, for example, to an upper middle income countries or a higher income countries. Thank you so much.
Yes, one more question over there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, all the lecturers. My name is Steve Choice, working for Kutra as a trade advisors. But I have one question to Mr. E from WTO. So, as you know, we, Korea, concluded 15 FTAs as, in both bilateral and multilaterals to avoid protectionism worldwide. But these days, I feel that many non-tariff barriers, NTB, is occurred instead of just prefer this protectionism. So, I have one question. Do you have any policy or measures to reduce that kind of non-tariff barriers? NTB is like technical barrier on trade, TBTs, in WTO organizations. Please tell me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll close the questions from the floor. I will specifically ask Professor Evanet for the first question, and then Deputy Director General Li Xiaojian later.
Thank you. So I'd like to talk about this localization trend to emerging markets. If you look very carefully at what GE said is going to do and what other large companies say they're going to do, they are localizing production to the very largest emerging markets. They are not going to be localizing production to small countries with very small markets because they are essentially, it's too expensive to set up there. You will not get economies of scale and you will not be able to lower price. They will not be able to get costs down to levels which the customers can buy. So if anyone's thinking that this localization trend is going to help out the smallest markets or the countries with the smallest markets, forget it. That's not what's happening. And the large emerging markets who are getting these factories are doing so at a price. They're having to offer either very high prices in government contracts or subsidies and other types of financial incentives. So please don't think this is, just because you see the factory moving, that this is necessarily good news. You have to dig deeper and ask why is the production moving in that way. The second thing I would just say here is there was an enormous amount of work done on the impact of local content requirements in the 1970s and 80s in rich countries and in developing countries of all levels. The record is terrible here, and it's not, and it's across the board. I really think it's across the board. So I would not recommend that. I think the question you ended with is the right question. Given that we want to see living standards rising in developing countries, what are the best ways of doing this which do not essentially end up transferring lots of money to the shareholders of multinational corporations? That's the question.
Thank you. Deputy Director General E, please.
Thank you for the question. I think the question from representative of Morocco is whether WTO can do more to create new disciplines on investment or trade-related investment. For the moment, we have trends. Maybe the performance or the record of implementation may not be that satisfactory, but the question is whether or how we what kind of new rules we need, or how can we improve the implementation. So we need you to push your government to raise the issue in WTO. And as for non-tariff barriers, it's a big issue. And most developing countries are very much concerned about it. Nowadays, they are pushing the discussion in WTO. So we encourage to push your government to raise the issue, and let's see whether it can be delivered by MC11 next year.
Thank you. Professor Owen, do you want to say something? No? Then thank you very much for questions from the floor and also all the panelists and the paper presenters. I would like to close this session. Before I do that, it's not my question directly to you, but I have some kind of observation also. I went to a 3-day conference which was held in Doha, Qatar last week. We covered many different issues, but in the area of trade, we have two main points there. Many people in that conference are hoping that China should play more conducive roles, while U.S. is reverting back to the protectionism, in all levels. So I don't know. At this moment, it's very important for Chinese leaders to provide some leadership in the regional trade agreement or at the WTO. This is the kind of consensus we are getting at that conference. The second thing is, for all topics, because of we didn't discuss. You say something, but we didn't discuss about public sentiment on trade. I mean, income inequality. I mean, trade is not a major reason why we have income inequality, but politically, it's easy to say that trade, we have to blame trade or immigration or things like that. But even we have to consider when we, implement trade policies, we have to talk about more seriously how to help those people who are dislocated because of international trade. The U.S. and even Korea has TAA program, Trade Adjustment Assistance. But I think we have to think about more in implementing that kind of policies, because you need more. Somebody mentioned about education and training. I think we need more emphasis on capacity enlarging for small and medium-sized companies, and also for laborers, human capital enhancing kind of, very detailed schemes. I think unless we do this kind of public sentiment will be used by political rhetoric, and we never find a place for free trade. So I think this is a very important theme I got from that conference. But I think we learned a lot through this session. Thank you very much. So now I would like to close the session. Please join me in thanking our speakers and panelists. Thank you very much.